The strongest people rarely announce who they are. They simply let time introduce them. The lunch bell echoed through Greystone Correctional Facility as hundreds of inmates streamed into the dining hall beneath rows of bright fluorescent lights. Stainless steel tables stretched across the room. Correctional officers stood watch from elevated platforms, and the familiar sounds of trays sliding across serving counters blended into a steady chorus of conversation. Near the far wall, where few people paid much attention, Calvin Brooks slowly pushed an old custodial cart between the tables, carefully wiping away small spills before anyone could slip. At 69 years old, Calvin moved with quiet purpose. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his uniform was spotless despite the nature of his work, and every movement seemed measured rather than hurried. He greeted officers with polite respect, nodded kindly to inmates who returned the gesture, and never complained about the endless routine that filled each day. Most people barely noticed him. Those who did usually assumed he was simply another elderly janitor trying to finish his shift before the next meal began. That afternoon, however, every eye in the dining hall would eventually remember exactly where Calvin Brooks had been standing. At the center of the cafeteria sat Travis Coleman, the undisputed prison bully of the East Housing Unit. Tall, loud, and surrounded by several white inmates who eagerly laughed at his jokes, Travis enjoyed reminding everyone that respect inside the prison belonged to those who demanded it. As Calvin slowly guided his cart past the table, Travis leaned back in his chair with a grin that instantly caught the attention of the men around him. One of them whispered something that caused the group to laugh even harder. Calvin continued walking without looking in their direction. He had clearly heard them, yet nothing in his expression changed. Travis reached for a bowl of hot soup resting on his tray, glanced toward the others for approval, and then deliberately tipped the bowl forward. The soup splashed across the side of Calvin's custodial cart, stained the front of his work apron, and dripped onto the polished cafeteria floor. Laughter burst from Travis's table, while nearby conversations stopped almost immediately. Several inmates looked away, unwilling to become involved. Others watched quietly, expecting the elderly janitor to protest or lose his temper. Instead, Calvin looked down at the spilled soup for a brief moment before reaching calmly into his cart for a clean towel. He carefully wiped the handle, cleaned the floor one slow section at a time, and then straightened the supplies that had shifted inside the cart. When he finally looked at Travis, his voice remained gentle and steady. Everyone has a choice about the person they become today. The words were so calm that they almost disappeared beneath the fading laughter. Travis smirked and shrugged as though the comment meant nothing. "You should worry about your mop, old man." Calvin simply smiled. "I hope the rest of your day is better than this moment." Without another word, he resumed pushing the custodial cart toward the next aisle. The dining hall gradually returned to its usual noise, but not everyone resumed eating. A middle-aged correctional officer named Daniel Harper quietly watched Calvin disappear through the service doorway. Something about the older man's posture felt strangely familiar. It was not confidence. It was not pride. It was the unmistakable composure of someone who had spent an entire lifetime refusing to let other people decide his character. Harper continued watching until Calvin disappeared from sight. Across the room, Travis laughed with his friends, convinced the incident had proven exactly what he wanted everyone to believe. Yet a handful of older inmates exchanged thoughtful glances instead of joining the laughter. They had noticed something different. The elderly janitor had never flinched, never hurried, never argued, and never once looked embarrassed. It was almost as though the humiliation belonged to someone else entirely, and for reasons nobody inside Greystone Correctional Facility could yet explain, that quiet reaction left a stronger impression than any loud display of anger ever could. The afternoon passed quietly across Greystone Correctional Facility, but the incident in the dining hall lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Conversations resurfaced in small groups as inmates returned to their assigned jobs. Yet every version of the story ended with the same unanswered question. Why had Calvin Brooks remained so calm? Most people expected anger, embarrassment, or at least a sharp reply. Instead, the elderly janitor had simply cleaned the floor and continued his work as though nothing important had happened. Calvin pushed his custodial cart through the education wing, carefully polishing handrails and collecting discarded paper cups left outside classrooms. Every movement followed the same deliberate rhythm. He checked corners before turning, returned every cleaning bottle to the exact place on the cart, and quietly greeted everyone he passed with the same polite smile. A younger maintenance worker named Leon Walker caught up beside him while carrying a box of replacement light bulbs. "I heard what happened in the cafeteria," Leon said. Calvin nodded gently. "News travels quickly around here." Leon looked down at the stained apron that Calvin had already washed clean. Most people would still be talking about it. Calvin adjusted a folded towel on the cart before answering. "Holding on to unpleasant moments rarely makes the next hour any better." Leon laughed softly. "You always have an answer like that?" Calvin smiled. "Only after making enough mistakes to learn from them." Meanwhile, in the recreation yard, Travis Coleman sat on a concrete bench surrounded by several inmates who continued congratulating him for humiliating the old janitor. Travis accepted their praise with obvious satisfaction, convinced he had strengthened his reputation once again. One inmate asked why Calvin had not reacted. Travis shrugged confidently. "Because he knows his place." The others nodded, but one older inmate named Raymond Ellis quietly disagreed. He had watched Calvin work for nearly 4 years and had never once seen him lose his composure. "Maybe," Raymond said calmly. "Or maybe he has learned something the rest of us have not." Travis laughed dismissively. "He pushes a mop for a living." Raymond looked toward the maintenance building where Calvin had disappeared earlier that afternoon. "Sometimes the job a person does tells you very little about the life they have already lived." Travis waved away the comment and changed the subject, but Raymond's words remained with several inmates long after the conversation ended. Back inside the main corridor, Officer Daniel Harper continued reviewing security footage from the cafeteria, not because policy required it, but because something about Calvin's reaction refused to leave his thoughts. He watched the recording several times. Travis laughed. The soup spilled. Nearby inmates reacted immediately. Calvin did something different. Instead of looking at the man who had embarrassed him, he first looked at the floor, identified every place that needed to be cleaned, secured the wheels of his custodial cart before it could roll, and only then addressed Travis in a calm voice. Harper leaned closer to the monitor. The sequence seemed almost automatic, as though Calvin had spent years training himself to assess situations before responding emotionally. "Interesting," Harper whispered. Later that evening, Calvin entered the prison library to return a worn biography he had finished reading during his breaks. The librarian handed him another history book without being asked. "You always bring these back on time," she said with a smile. Calvin accepted the book with quiet gratitude. Stories are easier to appreciate when they are shared. As he turned to leave, he noticed a stack of books beginning to slide from the edge of a return cart. With one smooth motion, he steadied the stack before a single volume reached the floor, then continued walking without waiting for anyone to notice. The librarian blinked in surprise. "Thank you," she called after him. Calvin simply raised one hand in acknowledgement before disappearing into the hallway. Officer Harper happened to witness the brief moment from the opposite end of the corridor. Once again, Calvin had moved with quiet precision, never hurried, never dramatic, and never seeking attention. Harper found himself asking the same question that had been growing stronger since lunchtime. Who exactly had spent a lifetime developing that kind of discipline? And why was he now quietly pushing a custodial cart through Greystone Correctional Facility as though it were the most ordinary place in the world? The following morning began before sunrise, when the soft buzz announcing the first inmate count echoed through Greystone Correctional Facility. Calvin Brooks was already awake. His custodial uniform hung neatly pressed on a metal hook. His work boots rested side by side beneath the narrow bench, and the history book he had borrowed from the library lay carefully closed with a folded bookmark tucked between its pages. He followed the same routine every day without exception. He straightened his small storage locker, checked the supplies assigned to his cleaning cart, and quietly wished the overnight officer a pleasant morning before beginning his shift. Few people noticed these habits, yet everyone who worked alongside him eventually realized that Calvin never hurried and never wasted a movement. Every action seemed practiced through decades of quiet discipline. As breakfast preparations began, Calvin entered the main service corridor where kitchen workers pushed carts loaded with trays, utensils, and steaming food containers toward the cafeteria. The narrow hallway became crowded with inmates assigned to food service and maintenance crews moving in opposite directions. Most people squeezed past each other with little patience, eager to finish their assignments before the first meal service. Calvin simply stepped aside whenever someone needed extra room, offering a polite smile instead of frustration. A young inmate carrying a heavy box of disposable cups stumbled after catching his foot against a floor drain. Before the box slipped from his hands, Calvin calmly reached forward, steadied one corner with effortless timing, and helped him regain his balance. "Thank you," the young man said with visible relief. Calvin nodded kindly. Everyone needs a steady hand once in a while. Officer Daniel Harper happened to witness the brief exchange from the security station. Once again, the older janitor had reacted before anyone else seemed to recognize what was happening. Harper folded his arms thoughtfully, remembering the cafeteria footage from the previous afternoon. It was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss Calvin's awareness as simple coincidence. Later that morning, Calvin reported to the vocational training building, where several classrooms required cleaning before afternoon programs began. Leon Walker joined him while replacing worn floor mats near the entrance. "You have worked here longer than almost anyone," Leon said. "Have you ever thought about retiring?" Calvin smiled as he carefully aligned the edge of a hallway runner with the tile pattern beneath it. "A meaningful day does not depend on the title attached to the work." Leon laughed softly. "You always make ordinary jobs sound important." Calvin looked around the quiet hallway before answering. People remember how they are treated long after they forget who cleaned the floor. Their conversation was interrupted by loud voices drifting from the nearby recreation corridor. Travis Coleman walked past with several white inmates following behind him, speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. As he noticed Calvin polishing a brass handrail, Travis slowed his pace and grinned. "Still cleaning up after everyone else?" Calvin looked up with the same calm expression he always carried. "Someone has to keep the place ready for tomorrow." The simple answer drew a few quiet smiles from maintenance workers nearby. Travis expected irritation, not courtesy. He shook his head dismissively before continuing down the corridor, but he glanced back once more, clearly unsettled that the older man refused to react the way everyone else usually did. Officer Harper watched the entire exchange without stepping in. The words themselves were unremarkable, yet Harper noticed something else. Calvin never focused on the insult. Instead, he remained completely attentive to the surroundings, almost as though he naturally measured every voice, every doorway, and every movement around him. That afternoon, Harper entered the staff break room, where several veteran officers discussed upcoming training requirements. One instructor mentioned an advanced leadership seminar from many years earlier, causing Harper to pause. A vague memory surfaced before disappearing again, leaving behind only the impression of a calm instructor who had once spoken about discipline as though it were a daily habit rather than a special skill. Harper could not remember the man's name, or even where the seminar had taken place, but the feeling was strong enough that he quietly resolved to search through the facility's archive training materials after his shift ended. Meanwhile, Calvin continued pushing his custodial cart through the long hallway with the same steady pace that had become part of Greystone Correctional Facility itself, completely unaware that his quiet habits were beginning to awaken memories in people who had crossed paths with him many years before. By the middle of the week, Calvin Brooks had quietly become one of the most discussed people inside Greystone Correctional Facility without ever seeking attention. He continued arriving before every shift, polishing handrails until they reflected the overhead lights, organizing storage rooms with remarkable precision, and greeting everyone with the same steady kindness that never seemed forced. Inmates who barely noticed the elderly janitor before the cafeteria incident now found themselves watching him from across the corridors. The strange part was not that Calvin worked hard. Plenty of people worked hard. What puzzled them was that nothing seemed capable of disturbing his composure. Whether someone thanked him, ignored him, or mocked him, his expression remained almost exactly the same. That quiet consistency unsettled more people than anger ever could. Late that morning, Leon Walker pushed a supply cart beside Calvin through the vocational building while checking inventory sheets. "I have been meaning to ask you something," Leon said. Calvin looked up with a friendly smile. "Go ahead." Leon hesitated before speaking. "How do you stay so patient with everyone?" Calvin carefully returned a bottle of floor cleaner to its proper place before answering. "Patience becomes easier once you realize that every person is carrying a story you cannot see." Leon chuckled. Even someone like Travis? Calvin nodded gently. Especially someone like Travis. Before Leon could respond, a loud metallic sound echoed from the maintenance workshop farther down the hallway. Several inmates instinctively turned toward the noise as a tall storage cabinet began leaning after one of its front wheels caught against an uneven section of concrete. Cleaning supplies stacked along the top shelf slowly shifted toward the edge. Two younger maintenance workers froze for a split second, unsure which direction to move. Calvin quietly walked forward without rushing. "Step to your left," he said calmly to one worker. "You, hold the bottom corner." His voice remained steady and clear. Both young men followed the instructions almost automatically. Calvin placed one hand against the side of the cabinet just long enough for another worker to secure the loose wheel with a wooden block. Within seconds, the cabinet stood safely in place again. No bottle shattered. No equipment was damaged. No one raised a voice. The entire incident ended almost as quickly as it had begun. One of the younger workers blinked in surprise. "How did you know exactly what to do?" Calvin smiled modestly. Sometimes the first calm voice people hear becomes the one they trust. Leon looked at Calvin with growing admiration. "You made that look easy." Calvin shook his head. "The people around me solved the problem. I simply reminded them to slow down." Officer Daniel Harper had witnessed everything from the open office doorway. He replayed the moment in his mind, while watching Calvin quietly return to polishing the hallway floor as though nothing unusual had happened. Harper noticed something that most people had overlooked. Calvin had never looked directly at the leaning cabinet first. He had looked at the people. He had immediately recognized who needed guidance, who was already moving correctly, and where everyone should stand. The response felt less like instinct and more like years of practiced leadership. That observation stayed with Harper throughout the afternoon. After completing his reports, he walked into the facility archive room where decades of outdated training binders filled several metal shelves. Dust covered many of the boxes, and few officers ever entered unless searching for old certification records. Harper removed one binder after another, scanning faded class photographs and instructor rosters while trying to recapture the memory that had been growing stronger each day. He did not know exactly what he was searching for, only that somewhere in those forgotten records he believed he had seen the same calm eyes, the same measured posture, and the same quiet confidence years before. Meanwhile, Calvin finished mopping the final section of the vocational hallway, thanked Leon for his help, and slowly pushed his custodial cart toward the next building. Behind him, several inmates watched in thoughtful silence. They no longer saw only an elderly janitor. They saw someone whose calm presence seemed to make difficult moments feel strangely manageable, and none of them could explain why. Thursday morning arrived beneath steady rain that tapped softly against the long rows of narrow windows overlooking the central yard of Greystone Correctional Facility. Inside the maintenance department, Calvin Brooks followed the same routine he had practiced for years. He checked each bottle on his custodial cart, replaced worn cleaning cloths with fresh ones, and quietly reviewed the work schedule posted beside the supply room door. Every task received the same careful attention, whether it involved polishing a hallway floor or replacing a damaged trash liner. Leon Walker often joked that Calvin treated every assignment as though someone important would inspect it later. Calvin always answered with the same gentle smile. Someone important usually does. The next person who walks through the door. As the morning progressed, more inmates began greeting Calvin by name instead of simply passing him without notice. Some thanked him for helping them find misplaced library books. Others appreciated the quiet advice he occasionally offered without making anyone feel embarrassed. None of those conversations lasted more than a minute, yet each one left people feeling strangely encouraged. Officer Daniel Harper noticed the growing respect while making his routine rounds. Earlier in the week, many inmates had laughed when Travis Coleman humiliated the elderly janitor in the cafeteria. Now the laughter had disappeared. Even inmates who normally avoided maintenance workers paused long enough to exchange a few polite words with Calvin before continuing down the corridor. Harper quietly wondered how one man had managed to change the atmosphere around him without ever asking anyone to admire him. Travis noticed the same change, and it irritated him more than he cared to admit. Standing with several white inmates near the entrance to the recreation yard, he watched as another maintenance worker thanked Calvin for helping reorganize a crowded storage room the previous afternoon. "Look at that," Travis muttered. "People are acting like he is some kind of hero because he pushes a mop." One of the younger inmates shrugged. "Maybe they just respect him." Travis shook his head. "Respect is taken, not given." Raymond Ellis, who happened to be sitting on a nearby bench, quietly looked up from the newspaper he had been reading. "The kind that has to be taken usually disappears first." Travis frowned but chose not to argue. Instead, he walked away toward the vocational building, determined to remind everyone who still controlled the social order inside the prison. A short time later, Calvin and Leon entered the old workshop where maintenance equipment was stored. The room contained shelves stacked with paint cans, electrical supplies, and replacement tools that had accumulated over many years. As Leon searched for a box of replacement gloves, one of the fluorescent light fixtures above the aisle flickered several times before going dark. Without saying a word, Calvin looked up, glanced toward the circuit panel on the opposite wall, then calmly walked across the room. He studied the panel for only a moment before pointing toward a breaker labeled with faded handwriting. "Try that one first," he suggested. Leon flipped the switch, and the lights immediately returned. Leon laughed in amazement. "How did you know?" Calvin smiled modestly. "Buildings speak through patterns. You simply have to notice them." Before Leon could ask another question, Daniel Harper entered the workshop carrying a clipboard. He had come to verify inventory reports, but stopped when he overheard the conversation. "You seem to understand a little about everything," Harper observed. Calvin rested both hands on the handle of his custodial cart. "Life has a way of teaching people who keep paying attention." Harper nodded thoughtfully. The answer sounded simple, yet it carried the weight of long experience. As Calvin pushed the cart toward the hallway, Harper found himself watching the older man's posture once again. It was the same steady walk, the same constant awareness of every doorway and every person nearby, and the same calm expression that never seemed affected by praise or criticism. The feeling returned stronger than ever. Somewhere, many years earlier, Harper was certain he had watched another man move through crowded rooms with that exact quiet confidence. He still could not remember where, but with each passing day, the missing piece of that memory felt closer than ever. While Calvin Brooks continued his work exactly as always, completely unaware that his ordinary acts of kindness were slowly uncovering an extraordinary past. Friday afternoon settled quietly over Greystone Correctional Facility as steady rain continued tapping against the high windows overlooking the central corridor. The maintenance schedule remained unchanged, and Calvin Brooks pushed his custodial cart through the administration hallway with the same calm pace that had become familiar to everyone who worked nearby. He greeted reception officers by name, emptied recycling bins, polished the brass handrails, and paused briefly to straighten a framed emergency evacuation map that had shifted slightly on the wall. Every small task received the same careful attention. Officer Daniel Harper noticed the quiet routine from the security desk and found himself studying Calvin once again. The elderly janitor never seemed distracted. His eyes naturally moved from hallway intersections to doorways, and then back to the people around him, almost as though he instinctively maintained awareness of the entire environment. Without making it obvious, Harper had seen that habit before somewhere, but the memory remained frustratingly incomplete. At the opposite end of the corridor, Travis Coleman watched several inmates thanking Calvin for helping organize the vocational workshop earlier that morning. The sight clearly irritated him. "People forget their place too quickly," Travis muttered before walking directly toward the custodial cart. Several inmates immediately noticed the direction he was heading, and conversations quietly faded. Calvin looked up with the same relaxed expression he always carried. "Good afternoon," he said politely. Travis ignored the greeting and deliberately nudged a bucket resting beside the cart with his boot. The bucket tipped sideways, sending clean water slowly across the polished floor. A few inmates waited for the elderly janitor to react with frustration. Calvin simply looked at the spreading water before calmly reaching for a floor squeegee. "Thank you," he said unexpectedly. Travis frowned. "For what?" Calvin smiled gently while guiding the water toward a nearby drain. "Now I know this section needed another cleaning anyway." A few inmates exchanged puzzled looks. The answer had completely removed the satisfaction Travis expected to feel. Determined to provoke a different reaction, Travis stepped closer. "Do you ever get tired of cleaning up after everyone else?" Calvin rested both hands on the handle of the squeegee before answering. Cleaning a floor is much easier than cleaning a damaged reputation. The hallway became noticeably quieter. There was no anger in Calvin's voice, only calm sincerity. Travis opened his mouth to respond, but before another word could be spoken, an unexpected alarm sounded from the nearby maintenance storage room. A loud warning tone echoed through the corridor after a supply rack shifted against an emergency exit sensor, triggering the alert system. Several inmates instinctively looked toward the flashing light, while one newer correctional officer hurried from the adjoining office, unsure which procedure to follow first. Without raising his voice, Calvin calmly pointed toward the wall-mounted reset station. "Officer, the sensor has been bumped. Secure the door first, then reset the panel. The alarm will clear automatically." The officer followed the instructions exactly as given. Within moments, the warning tone stopped, and normal operations resumed without confusion or panic. Officer Harper watched the entire exchange with growing astonishment. Calvin had not only recognized the source of the alarm almost immediately, but he had also understood the proper sequence for resolving it before anyone else in the hallway. The younger officer walked over with an appreciative smile. "Thank you, sir. I have only been here 3 weeks." Calvin nodded kindly. Every experienced professional was once new. As the officer returned to his post, Harper continued staring thoughtfully at Calvin. The words, the composure, and the effortless leadership all felt increasingly familiar. Nearby inmates also noticed something they had never seen before. Travis had come looking for another public humiliation, yet somehow the hallway had ended with people quietly listening to the elderly janitor instead. Calvin returned the squeegee to his cart, checked that every cleaning bottle remained properly secured, and resumed his route without another glance behind him, completely unaware that more people than ever had begun wondering what kind of life could shape someone into a man who made calm leadership appear so completely natural. The events of Friday afternoon continued echoing through Greystone Correctional Facility long after the hallway had returned to its normal routine. What surprised people was not that Calvin Brooks had remained calm once again. By now, everyone expected that. What unsettled them was how naturally correctional officers had begun listening to him during unexpected situations. Small conversations spread from one housing unit to another, each adding another layer to the growing mystery surrounding the elderly janitor. Some inmates believed he must have worked in law enforcement years ago. Others guessed he had once been a teacher or an emergency responder. Nobody imagined the truth. Officer Daniel Harper, however, had stopped guessing. As soon as his evening shift ended, he returned to the records archive beneath the administration building. Dust covered the shelves containing decades of forgotten binders, instructor manuals, and retired training materials that few people had opened in years. Harper carefully worked through one cabinet after another until he discovered a large storage box labeled National Leadership Development Conferences. Inside were dozens of faded photographs, attendance rosters, and instructional guides dating back more than 30 years. He slowly turned each page, studying every group photograph until one image immediately captured his attention. A younger black instructor stood near the center of a class composed of military personnel and correctional supervisors from across the country. Although the photograph had faded with age, Harper recognized the same composed posture, the same calm expression, and the same unmistakable eyes he had been seeing every day inside Greystone. He looked closer at the caption beneath the photograph. "Calvin Brooks, Senior Instructor." Harper felt a chill travel across his shoulders. He opened the accompanying conference booklet and found several pages describing the guest instructors. One short biography immediately stood out. It mentioned that Calvin Brooks had spent 3 decades developing leadership, discipline, and decision-making for elite military personnel assigned to highly demanding responsibilities. Operational details had been intentionally omitted, but the summary clearly stated that his instruction had influenced generations of specialized service members. Harper quietly closed the booklet and stared at the photograph for several long seconds. Memories that had remained buried for years suddenly became clear. Early in his own career, Harper had attended a professional seminar where one instructor repeatedly reminded every student that real authority came from earning trust before giving commands. Harper had carried that lesson throughout his entire career without ever remembering the instructor's name. Now he finally knew why Calvin's voice had sounded so familiar. Early the next morning, Harper carried the conference binder directly to Warden Nathan Reynolds. The warden listened quietly while Harper placed the faded photograph across the desk beside several archived training documents. Reynolds studied the picture before comparing it with Calvin's employee identification photograph stored in the personnel database. The resemblance was unmistakable despite the passing years. "Are you certain?" Reynolds asked. Harper nodded without hesitation. "I would stake my career on it." Reynolds immediately requested access to additional employment records that had accompanied Calvin when he accepted the custodial position years earlier. Most of the documents contained only routine hiring information, but one sealed verification letter from a federal agency required administrative authorization before it could be opened. Reynolds quietly entered the necessary approval code while Harper waited beside the desk. Neither man spoke as the document slowly appeared on the computer screen. Before either of them finished reading the first page, both realized they had only begun discovering who Calvin Brooks truly was. Meanwhile, completely unaware that forgotten records were bringing his past back into the light, Calvin carefully arranged fresh cleaning supplies on his custodial cart before beginning another ordinary morning. He greeted Leon Walker with his usual smile, wished several correctional officers a pleasant day, and slowly pushed the cart toward the main corridor with the same humble purpose that had guided him every morning for years, never imagining that the quiet life he had chosen was about to become impossible for anyone inside Greystone Correctional Facility to overlook. Warden Nathan Reynolds remained silent as he finished reading the federal verification letter displayed on his computer screen. The document contained very few operational details, yet every sentence carried unusual significance. It confirmed that Calvin Brooks had devoted 3 decades to training elite military personnel selected for some of the nation's most demanding responsibilities. The specific assignments remained classified, and many sections had been intentionally withheld, but one statement appeared in full without redaction. Calvin Brooks had served as a senior instructor responsible for preparing experienced soldiers to make sound decisions under the highest levels of pressure. Reynolds slowly leaned back in his chair and looked toward Officer Daniel Harper. "This explains everything," he said quietly. Harper nodded, still holding the faded conference photograph in his hands. His awareness, his patience, the way he guides people without making them feel small. None of it was accidental. Reynolds closed the file, and he never mentioned any of it. Harper smiled faintly. That may be the strongest proof that every word in this letter is true. Later that morning, Reynolds asked Calvin to stop by the administration office under the ordinary pretense of reviewing annual employment paperwork. The request attracted little attention. Calvin parked his custodial cart neatly beside the hallway wall, wiped his hands with a clean towel, and entered the office with the same respectful smile he offered everyone. "Good morning, Warden," he said warmly. "You wanted to see me?" Reynolds invited him to take a seat before placing the faded conference photograph on the desk. Calvin looked down at the picture and smiled with quiet recognition. "I remember that class," he said softly. "They were remarkable people." Reynolds studied him carefully. "You were the instructor." Calvin nodded. "I was fortunate enough to spend many years teaching professionals who had already dedicated their lives to serving others." Harper stood quietly near the office door, listening with growing admiration. Reynolds opened the verification letter. "This confirms that you trained elite military personnel for 30 years. Calvin folded his hands comfortably in his lap. "I had the privilege of helping experienced soldiers sharpen judgment, discipline, and leadership. They did the difficult work. I simply shared what my own teachers once shared with me." Reynolds looked genuinely surprised. "You could have spent every day telling people about your accomplishments." Calvin gently shook his head. A person's past should never become a reason to expect special treatment in the present. The room fell silent for several seconds. Harper finally spoke. "I attended one of your leadership seminars early in my career. I remembered your lessons long before I remembered your name." Calvin smiled warmly. Then the seminar succeeded. Reynolds closed the file and extended his hand across the desk. "Mr. Brooks, I want you to know how much respect you have earned inside this institution." Calvin accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Warden. Respect is always more meaningful when it grows naturally." As Calvin left the administration office carrying the same folded cleaning towel he had brought inside, several correctional officers noticed something unusual. Reynolds and Harper both stood as he walked out, a gesture rarely offered to anyone visiting the office. The small moment spread through the facility faster than any rumor. Nobody knew exactly what had been discussed behind the closed door, but everyone recognized that something significant had changed. Travis Coleman noticed the difference almost immediately. Officers who had once walked past Calvin with routine greetings now smiled, addressed him by name, and thanked him for his years of service whenever they crossed paths. Maintenance workers spoke to him with visible admiration, and even inmates who had ignored him only days earlier now stepped aside to let his custodial cart pass through crowded hallways. Travis watched the quiet transformation from across the corridor with growing confusion. He still did not know the full truth, but he understood one thing with complete certainty. The elderly janitor he had mocked so casually was no ordinary maintenance worker. Somewhere beyond the walls of Greystone Correctional Facility, Calvin Brooks had built a life so extraordinary that experienced correctional officers and the warden himself regarded him with genuine respect. Yet the man at the center of that respect continued pushing his custodial cart through the hallway with the same humble smile, as though character mattered far more than recognition ever could. Monday morning began with clear skies stretching above Greystone Correctional Facility, and although the schedule remained exactly the same, the atmosphere throughout the institution had quietly changed. Calvin Brooks arrived before sunrise as he always did, unlocked the maintenance supply room, inspected every item on his custodial cart, and began his rounds with the same unhurried pace that had defined every day of his employment. Nothing about his routine suggested that anything extraordinary had happened. He greeted correctional officers with a warm smile, wished Leon Walker a productive morning, and stopped briefly to return a misplaced library book that someone had accidentally left on a hallway bench. Yet everywhere he walked, people greeted him differently. Officers who once nodded politely now addressed him by name. Maintenance workers thanked him for lessons they had never realized they were learning. Even inmates stepped aside without being asked whenever his custodial cart approached. Calvin acknowledged every greeting with the same quiet humility, never behaving as though he expected special treatment. Later that morning, Warden Nathan Reynolds received 2 visitors from a federal leadership development organization who had requested permission to meet with Calvin after learning where he now worked. After their credentials were verified, Reynolds personally escorted them through the administration corridor toward the maintenance wing. Several correctional officers noticed the visitors carrying a carefully wrapped wooden presentation case. Word quietly spread through the facility before the group reached Calvin, who was polishing the brass handrail outside the education building. One of the visitors, retired Colonel Richard Hayes, smiled the moment he saw him. "Mr. Brooks," he said warmly, extending his hand, "it is an honor to see you again." Calvin looked pleasantly surprised before returning the handshake. "Colonel Hayes, it has certainly been a long time." Hayes laughed softly. "Not long enough for us to forget everything you taught." By now, several officers and inmates had quietly gathered nearby, pretending to continue their normal routines while listening from a respectful distance. Hayes opened the presentation case and removed a beautifully framed certificate recognizing Calvin's 30 years of service, developing leadership and sound judgment among elite military professionals. "Thousands of men and women carried your lessons into careers dedicated to serving others," Hayes said. "Many never met you personally, but your influence reached them through the instructors you prepared." Calvin accepted the certificate for a brief moment before gently returning it to Hayes. "Please keep it at the academy," he replied kindly. "Young instructors will benefit more from seeing it there than I ever would from keeping it for myself." Hayes smiled with unmistakable admiration. "That answer explains why everyone respected you." After the visitors departed, silence lingered across the hallway. Travis Coleman slowly walked toward Calvin, no longer surrounded by laughter or loud confidence. He stopped several feet away, lowered his eyes for a moment, and spoke more quietly than anyone inside Greystone had ever heard. "I was wrong about you," he admitted. Calvin rested both hands on the handle of his custodial cart. "We have all misunderstood someone at one time or another." Travis nodded. "I thought respect came from making people feel smaller." Calvin answered gently. "Real respect grows when people leave your presence feeling stronger instead." The words settled deeply over everyone listening nearby. Travis hesitated before extending his hand. Calvin accepted it without resentment, without reminding anyone of the spilled soup, and without asking for an apology beyond the sincerity already shown. As the afternoon sunlight filled the long hallway, Calvin quietly resumed pushing his custodial cart toward the next building. The polished floors still needed attention, trash bins still needed to be emptied, and another ordinary day of work continued exactly as before. Yet the people walking those same hallways had changed. They had discovered that genuine greatness rarely announces itself through titles, status, or reputation. Sometimes it wears a maintenance uniform, carries a mop instead of medals, and quietly serves others long after earning every reason to seek recognition. Long after Calvin Brooks disappeared around the corner, the lesson remained. Character is revealed most clearly not by the respect a person demands, but by the respect they continue to inspire when they no longer need to prove anything at all.